The world is both a wonderful and a terrible place. Ever occur to you? That it's both a wonderful and a terrible place. In recent years, we've plunged further into space and the wonders that are there. Not only plunging there by telescope, but going there, now planning to go to Mars, leaving this planet, moving out from beyond where we've ever reached before. We're plumbing the depths of the atom. Technology is getting smaller and smaller, and if you've had a medical procedure of any significance, you're a benefactor of such tiny technology. We enjoy things that our grandparents and our great-grandparents could have never even dreamed up. My grandparents were born in the 1890s. The American dream at that point was, at the point where they began their married life, was that there would be enough food, a chicken in every pot. Eventually, they would add a car in every garage and a chicken in every pot. My parents hoped for just, that they could own their own home, a modest home. Today, we have so many cars that you can't make a 30-mile commute in an hour. McMansions are springing up everywhere. A house that is good enough isn't ever good enough. It's got to be more. AM radio is given way to FM and radio itself is given way to MP3. MP3 is given way to streaming in the cloud. In addition to every chicken in the pot or every car in the garage, which we now take for granted, we carry around computers almost everywhere we go, believe it or not. We have serious computing power. You have it. Do you have it on you today? You certainly do. You have more computing power than NASA used to put the first astronauts into outer space. Right here, timing my sermon. Mine is, at least. I hope yours is not. It is a wonderful world, an amazing world. In many ways, at a pinnacle of human experience. It's almost hard to fathom, unless you watch the news and you see the terrible headlines about terrorists who want to only dominate and destroy and kill, about wars, rumors of wars, about executives looting their companies, leaving investors to hold the bag, about drugs and other threats to school. Did you know that heroin is one of the biggest drug problems at Westlake High School? Heroin. It is a wonderful world and a terrible world. I'm reminded of our gospel lesson today as I look at our world and I see both realities. I read the story of Jesus and his disciples visiting the temple in Jerusalem. They're from Galilee. That's kind of like being from Pemberville, Ohio. It's sort of the boondocks. It's quite rural. It's the sticks, where not much ever happens and nothing really glorious is ever built. Unless it happens sort of naturally. The homes and the churches are usually sort of modest. So when they're in Jerusalem and they're at the capital and they're at the temple, it's something spectacular to these guys. And the temple, it's hard for us to imagine. It covered about 35 acres, the Temple Mount. The walls of the sanctuary area were covered in marble. Huge stones weighing hundreds and hundreds of pounds, thousands and thousands of pounds. Decorated with gold leaf. When the sun shone on it, it was almost impossible to see. It was blinding in its glory. It was beautiful, breathtaking. It was meant to be the Crystal Cathedral of the first century. What a feat. The disciples, and that's probably a pretty good metaphor, actually, now that I say it out loud. The disciples responded pretty much as you would expect country boys on a visit to the big city to respond. They said, "Wow, look at that. That's amazing. That's incredible. What's really spectacular? Look at these stones. How did people do that?" And I think if those of us have visited Jerusalem and seen the Western Wall, we still say, how did they do that without machinery? Can you imagine trying to move one of those huge stones? I can hear the conversation that happens in the 21st century and probably happened in the first century. How in the world did they ever lift them into place? Jesus, take a look at this. Really, it's astounding. It's really amazing. Wow. But Jesus responded in a way that shocked them. Do you see these great buildings? There's not one that will be left here upon another. All these stones will be thrown down. You see, Jesus and the disciples looked at the same thing and they saw different things. The disciples saw something wonderful and sparkling and shiny and wonderful, they thought. And Jesus saw in the temple a symbol of corruption, human corruption at the heart of the temple system, which was supposed to represent God, which was not representing God very well at all. The disciples said, wow, and spectacular. And Jesus said, there's not going to be one stone left upon another. It's not going to stand much longer. This story is recalled around the time that the temple would have been destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. The gospel writer Mark recalls what Jesus had to say. And the disciples in 30 AD would have been about as shocked as those who had seen it happen in 70 AD. It was an unthinkable thought that the temple would be destroyed. They asked for a sign of when such a thing might happen. What do we look for? How are we going to know that that's going to happen? They're looking for security in the midst of news that's very insecure. Have you ever felt that way? Maybe this week. Looking for some security in the midst of insecurity. Jesus responded by telling them that terrible things would happen, that evil people would try to lead them astray, that there would be wars and there would be rumors of wars, and that nations would rise against nation, there would be earthquakes and there would be famines. It sounds like Jesus is about to answer their question, isn't it? Look at these signs. When you see these things, what sign will you give? It sounds like all these calamities, wars, earthquake, and famine will be signs of the end, that the end is near. But that isn't what Jesus is saying at all. He tells us of wars and rumors of wars, and then he says, but the end, it's yet to come. In other words, these wars and rumors of wars are not signs of anything, but simply the tribulations of living in any times, and that they come and that they go. I'm not sure that it's really ever been any difference from the time that Jesus spoke them to now. In the times of Martin Luther, there were wars and rumors of wars. In the time of Constantine, there were wars and rumors of wars. In the time of all of us, there's wars and rumors of wars. He tells of earthquakes and famines. Well, we've had a few of those in our lifetime, and certainly more than a few of those in the lifetimes of people between now and then. And he says of these things, these are the beginnings of birth pangs. Now I ask you, do birth pangs come at the beginning or at the end of a life? Most often, unless someone dies in childbirth, they come at the beginning of a life. The beginning, the birth pangs. Now, in the last verse, Jesus says in verse 8, he says these three things. There'll be earthquakes, famines, and birth pangs. Earthquakes, famines, and birth pangs. Now, one of these things is not like the other. Remember the song? Which one is not like the other? Birth pangs. Earthquakes and famines kill people. Birth pangs introduce something new to life. Birth pangs are different. Birth pangs issue forth into new life. Earthquakes and famines shake things up and kill people. But birth pangs means that something terrible is going to end in something wonderful. Then Jesus tells us about the coming of the Son of Man. He says his coming at the end of time, an event that will set all things right. Now here's a few things to think about. It will set all things right, will bring end to evil, and it will end suffering and bring rewards to the faithful. Now, I don't know how we get all messed up in the apocalypse being a terrible bloodbath, because that's what's promised at the end, is that he'll set all things right. There'll be an end to evil, an end to suffering, and there'll be rewards for the faithful. He tells us that when we experience tough times, they're not signs. They're just tough times. They are tough like birth pangs, temporary pain on the road to joy. Just like the temple. Jesus said that the temple would fall to the ground. And indeed, in 70 AD, when the Romans began their siege against Jerusalem, the emperor of Rome was so upset about insurgencies after insurgencies that he decided to take it down, all the way down, not one stone left upon the other. They burnt down trees. They wanted to razz the city until it looked as if no one had ever lived there. And they did a pretty good job. They started fires at the bottom of the wall of the temple, which is all fine and good. How could you bring down a great big wall like that? Except that when you get the fires hot enough, marble begins to turn brittle and cracks and crumbles and becomes dust. There's only one wall left of that temple, 35 acres. They brought it all down. The walls collapsed into great heaps. The Romans spent months, even years, leveling the city and chasing folks. We've got famous stories of Masada from that period of time. The emperor told them to do such a great job that no one would ever know that anybody ever lived there. Now, it sounds terrible, and indeed, it is terrible. But God used it as a preparation for something new. A new temple, Jesus said, there would be. Not a temple made with stones, not a temple made with mortar, a temple made of human flesh, as was foretold by the prophet Jeremiah, that it would be established in the hearts of individuals, in the hearts of nations. It would be a birth pang, and it would be a terrible thing, and it would be hard, and it would be filled with suffering, but it would end with new life, a new way of understanding our relationship with God, not God locked in a room, but alive in a fire in a heart. And all that took place before Jesus was crucified, when they talked about these things. And the cross itself becomes another example of birth pangs. It was a terrible event. We shouldn't hang roses on it, that's for sure. It was a terrible thing. And yet, through this terrible thing, God was working out salvation for all of us, bringing forth and issuing new life. And the message of chapter 13 of Mark's Gospel, what's called a little apocalypse, like the book of Daniel in the Old Testament or the book of Revelation in the New Testament, with this very difficult and very obscure and also frightening kind of language, is simply that Christians should expect that there will be tough times. Anybody not have a tough time yet? Maybe the girls. I don't know. Have you had tough times yet? No tough times? Well, that's because you got a good mom and dad. That's why. So count on that. But tough times come. They come to us all. But tough times in God's hands can be like birth pangs, prelims to great joy. Tough times are not signs of God's judgment. I don't know where we get this idea of connecting these things, although in some cases they can be corrections. Most tough times are just that. They're just an experience of a tough time, and God is trying to be with us in it. And in God's hands, those times can bring forth new birth. How many of you have faced some kind of adversary or some kind of difficulty, and when you came through it, though it was terrible and you never want to do it again, you came through with a renovated soul, with a renewal that you would have never had without it because of God's presence. The pain becomes sort of a memory compared to the joy that takes its place. Some Christians assume that if we do faith right, that it will lead to prosperity. It's called prosperity gospel when you hear it in the news. It's spreading like wildfire in the church and all kinds of places in the world. If our faith is sufficiently strong enough, if we have faith enough, if we're faithful and sufficiently true, God will reward us with all kinds of goodies. Francis Bacon had it right. He said, prosperity is the blessing of the Old Testament. Adversity is the blessing of the New. I'm not sure he went quite far enough. Prosperity is the blessing of the Old Testament. Adversity is the blessing of the New. But God turns adversity through tough people into times of blessing again. I think that's a message we need to hear in a week like this one. A message we need to hear in all the things that we face. As I look out over this group of people, all of you faced some tough times, some difficult things. They're not all the same. They're not all the same degree of difficulty, but they may be difficult for you, and you may not want to trade them for someone else's difficulty. And yet we all experience difficult times if we live long enough. Jesus experienced those things too, up to and including a violent death. But his death transformed death for all of us. It was a birth pang of something new being issued into the world, of eternal life. So the next time that times get kind of tough, and I get tough a lot, and perhaps they're tough right now, remember that you walk with the one who has suffered the toughest of tough times. And it is he who promises that he will be with you in the midst of those tough times, in your disappointments, in your frustrations, in your heartbreaks, in your infirmity, even in your death. And they are transformative moments for us, leading to joy. Chapter 13 of Mark calls us to live in faith, come what may, even in the midst of tough times. Schuller had it right in the title of his book he issued a few years back, Tough Times Never Last, but Tough People Do. I think that was pretty much true. Tough Christians can endure because they live in hope. So let's walk in faith in the middle of tough times, believing Jesus' promise that he redeems and reconciles all things, even our toughest moments, and that he brings light even into the darkest night. Because the end, whether it's here or near or far off, is not really the point. The point is, he is here, present with us in every tough time, redeeming and bringing hope and joy in the midst of sorrow, strength in the midst of weakness, power for living each day, no matter what the headlines. May we live in faith, walk in trust, inspired by his love, trusting always in his promise. Amen.